A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining today at this joint panel discussion titled Domestic Politics of South Asia, Special Focus on Sri Lanka. This webinar is jointly organized by the Pathfinder Foundation and the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. The panel will discuss the domestic politics of South Asia with special emphasis on Sri Lanka. The event will critically examine the complexities of Sri Lanka's domestic politics amidst significant economic challenges and socio-political transformations. Lastly, it will also explore the broader South Asian political environment, considering how regional dynamics both influence and are influenced by developments in Sri Lanka. Today, we are delighted to have with us the following guest speakers. Dr. Rajni Gamage, Research Fellow at Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, former Governor, Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and Distinguished Fellow at Pathfinder Foundation, Sri Lanka. Dr. Pakyasoti Sarvanamuthu, Executive Director at Center for Policy Alternatives, Sri Lanka. Dr. Chulani Atanayake, Non-Resident Fellow at Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and Sessional Lecturer, PhD Researcher at Swinburne University of Technology, Australia. This session will be moderated by Ambassador Bernard Gunathilake, Chairman at Pathfinder Foundation, Sri Lanka. Today's session will be live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page. I shall now invite Director of ISAS, Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sivia, to deliver the welcome remarks for the session. Dr. Sivia, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening to anybody, whichever part of the world they are joining us from today. Ambassador Bernard Gunathilake, Chairman, Pathfinder Foundation, Sri Lanka. Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, I welcome you to this joint panel organized between ISAS-NUS and Pathfinder Foundation Sri Lanka, entitled Domestic Politics of South Asia, Special Focus on Sri Lanka. Now, a number of adjectives can be used to describe the current domestic political scene in South Asia. We could describe it as exciting, we could describe it as interesting, we could describe it as concerning, and some have even described it as revolutionary or potentially revolutionary as well. What we know for sure is that 2024 has been an eventful year in the domestic political scene of a number of South Asian countries. A number of them are experiencing domestic churns, but also have witnessed significant political shifts. Elections have been held in a number of South Asian countries. These include India, Maldives, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Sri Lanka is poised for presidential elections very soon. And if we are following any news at all from South Asia, we will be aware of what's happening in Bangladesh. It just happened in Bangladesh as well. Bangladesh had witnessed the elections fairly recently, but more significantly, we've seen mass protests that have led to the president, Sheikh Hasina, fleeing, and the Prime Minister fleeing, and also questions being raised about the future of Bangladesh. Now, I start with this broad sort of sweep because I think it's important as we focus on Sri Lanka itself to bear in mind that while each South Asian country may have specific domestic contexts and imperatives, there's some macro issues that are affecting South Asian countries, many South Asian countries at least, and will have an impact on their domestic political scene. These include the fact that demographically, South Asia is a very young region. The youth are becoming increasingly important in elections, but they're also increasingly restive in many parts of South Asia. They are also riled by the high unemployment rates, particularly among youths in South Asia. They're affected by inflation. They are also witnessing and responding to issues such as rural distress. But they're also, and I emphasize, their politics and their political mobilization is also being influenced by the social media, and they're using technology to impact or effect political shifts. Now, all of these domestic issues are occurring within an evolving geopolitical and geo-economic order. And I might add something that we should think about looking ahead as well. And these are climatic shifts, which will definitely impact not only economic aspects of South Asia, but also political aspects of South Asia. Now, having made some broad comments about South Asia, I should focus on the issue at hand today because we are going to be specifically discussing the case of Sri Lanka. As all of us are familiar, Sri Lanka is grappling with and emerging from an economic crisis. I won't go into too much of that because we have a distinguished series of speakers who will be addressing various issues. But what I'll just sort of end my comments by saying is that if we look at what's going on in Sri Lanka, the elections are going to occur in a context in which the country is grappling with structural economic issues, which include domestic debt restructuring, new taxes, and issues such as increased electricity rates. These are going to raise questions among a number of Sri Lankans, but we have also already seen how these issues have led to and have been met by a diverse set of responses and reactions. Now, our speakers will also be addressing the fact that the geopolitical environment is also intertwined in this. Sri Lanka is essentially, if I could use the word, caught in a competition for influence between India and China, not only in Sri Lanka, but South Asia and the Indian Ocean. So as we think about Sri Lanka's forthcoming elections, it is important for us to survey, firstly, the political landscape. Secondly, engage with the key players and key issues that will shape the political trajectory of Sri Lanka, but also critically examine the impact of economic choices and assess the impact of international developments. And I'm glad that we have such a distinguished lineup of speakers today who will help us navigate our way around these complex questions. I'm going to end my comments by thanking our partner, Pathfinder Foundation, for their cooperation. And we've been developing a very cooperative and productive intellectual relationship. I see this as a step forward in that direction as well. And with that, I hand over the floor to Ambassador Gunanthilake, and I wish all of us a productive session today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Xavier. Good afternoon from Colombo, good evening to those who are in Singapore, and good morning to those who are in the United Kingdom or England. Thank you for your presentation, initial remarks. Dr. Rajini Gamage, Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, Dr. Pakithoti Sarvanamurthy, Dr. Chudani Kodikara, Dr. Daratna Silva from the Pathfinder Foundation, dear participants. This is an important seminar or webinar rather we are having today. Subject is what we are focusing is domestic politics in South Asia, with a special emphasis on the situation in Sri Lanka, as Professor Xavier mentioned a little while ago. The situation in South Asia has been quite volatile in the recent past. If you look at the situation as a whole in the region, you would recall the US troops were hastily withdrawn from Afghanistan in August 2021, after 2 decades of operations in that country, paving the way for the Taliban to return to power. Imran Khan, Prime Minister of Pakistan, who lost the no confidence motion in April 2022, was forced out of the office and was later jailed. In Sri Lanka, demonstrators forced the democratically elected president out of office in July 2022. They ransacked the president's and prime minister's residences and nearly took over the parliamentary complex. Then in April 2024, President Mohammad Muisu's pro-China party won a landslide election in Maldives. That was in April 2024. The resultant consequences for India-Maldives relations. Last month, that is July, Maoist firebrand Prachanda lost a no-confidence motion, and his 1.5-year government was ousted. He was replaced by Prime Minister Oli, who will have to go out in another 18 months' time under a power-sharing agreement. Then in June, Lok Sabha elections saw the return of Prime Minister Modi for the 3rd successive term, with a considerably lower or reduced number of seats in India. And a week ago, Bangladesh protesters demanding the removal of the job quota, which had been there for many decades, they succeeded in driving Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina out of office and out of the country. So this is the performance sheet or the balance sheet for South Asia. That's what I mentioned, a fairly volatile region if you look at the history of the country going back to several years. Our focus today will be on developments in Sri Lanka with the presidential election due in just 40 days. As we all know, Sri Lanka has gone through a tumultuous time since 2019, beginning with Easter holiday bombings, the COVID-19 that followed, and post-COVID economic meltdown, which was quite a serious situation, which resulted in the ouster of the popularly elected president, which almost threatened the democratic institutions of the country. The presidential election in the country will have to be followed by parliamentary elections, provincial elections, etc., which most probably will take place in 2025. If these elections are not handled with skill, there will be adverse effects affecting the political canvas of the country. Now, today's webinar will focus on four subjects: the current political landscape and challenges. Second one will be socio-economic dynamics of the country. Third item will be current socio-political undercurrents. And four will be the impact of regional geopolitics in the Sri Lankan elections. We are fortunate to have an eminent panel to discuss each of these themes, and I'm confident that their presentations will help the participants to understand the ground situation in Sri Lanka better, and hopefully where the country is likely to end up following the, although there are 20 different or more than 20 different contestants, it will be a 3 or 4 cornered fight for the presidency. Now, with this short introduction, I plan to invite the first presenter, Dr. Rajini Gamage, who will speak on Sri Lanka's current political landscape and challenges. Rajini Gamage is a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Her research interests are in politics of governance and state transformation and development inequality in Sri Lanka. She holds a PhD in political science and international relations from the University of Queensland, Australia, a postdoctorate from NUS, and Master of Science in International Relations from Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and a Bachelor of Social Science in Political Science from NUS. With this brief introduction, may I request Dr. Rajini Gamage to speak. There is time, please be aware that we have limited time. And I hope you will be able to make your presentation within the allotted time. Dr. Gamage, you have it.
Thank you, Ambassador Gunatilaka. I will be sharing some slides during my presentation, so I would like to check if everyone can see them first. Is it clear? Hello?
Yes, Rajini,
Yes,
we can
they're
see.
clear to me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So again, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak on this panel today. I will speak very quickly. I understand there's a short time constraint. It's difficult to give justice to the various political parties and camps that have emerged in the lead up to the presidential elections, but I'll try and at least go briefly through each of them. So to set the stage, as mentioned by Ambassador Gurithilaka before, Sri Lanka's presidential elections are slated for next month. And these elections are significant for a number of reasons, the foremost of them being that these are the first elections after the 2022 economic crisis and the mass street protests, which ousted President Gotabaya Rajapaksa from power. These elections are also important because these are the first elections that are held since 2020 at all 4 levels of government. And what this means is that the public legitimacy of the current government is relatively low because no elections have been held since 2020, despite the intensified social and political contestations that have happened in the interim. Finally, these elections are also significant. As Ambassador Gurithilaka mentioned, this is likely to be a 3-way presidential contest and possibly could be the first time that a second round is activated. So to explain to those of our listeners who are not very familiar with Sri Lanka's presidential electoral system, it's a type of preferential voting where voters rank up to 3 candidates, so 3 preferences. And if no candidate is able to secure at least 50% of the vote in the first round, a second round is activated. And in the second round, it is only the top 2 candidates that are taken. All other candidates are eliminated, but the second and the third preferences of those candidates, of those voters whose first preference has been eliminated, those second and third preferences are added to the first and second candidates. And then based on which candidate reaches a majority in this second round, a winner is declared. So we can discuss the potential implications, the political implications, which particular political camp is, likely to be favored during the Q&A session. Before I move on to the various political candidates and the political parties in the lead up to the presidential elections in Sri Lanka, I will briefly talk about the issues that are likely to dominate this election and in response to what developments the political campaigns are legitimizing. Here, understanding the collapse of political legitimacy of the Gotabaya government in 2022 is important. And this requires looking at the mandate of that government and also looking at what the demands of the Aragalaya, the mass protests, were. Now, the mass protests were immediately about the breakdown of everyday life, but fundamentally in response to the inability of the Gotabaya government to deliver on the material aspirations and development model it promised. With resulting breakdown of this social contract, the Aragalaya emphasized system change which had been championed by past governments and uprisings, but the Aragalaya emphasized it with in a fresh manner. There were various interpretations of this system change within the Aragalaya, but the common minimum on which the liberal, nationalist, and left redistributive groups converged upon was good and effective governance. So the key political campaigns that I'm going to describe next, I understand them as mobilizing in response to this, particularly in response to the economic governance, given that we are in the immediate aftermath of an economic crisis, as these campaigns try to win political legitimacy and renegotiate a social contract. So moving quickly, the first of the 3 main candidates is the incumbent President Ranil Wickremesinghe. He's the leader of the UMP and is currently running on an independent platform. Arguably, this independent platform allows members of other parties to join and form a broad electoral campaign. Now, Wickremesinghe's main mandate is economic stabilization and the uninterrupted continuation of IMF reforms program, as well as the promise of a full implementation of the 13th Amendment. The president's campaign narrative is of being the only one who stepped up to the task during the 2022 crisis. Wickremesinghe's popularity is impacted negatively, however, by anger and frustrations with the economic impact of the reforms program, for his alliance with the Rajapaksas, and criticism towards the government is also how some democratic freedoms and processes are violated or threatened in the name of bringing economic stability, the so-called stability state. In the lead up to elections, the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, the governing party, has split over the issue of whom to back. So 94 SLPP MPs are claimed to have declared support for the president, along with the Mahajan Eksat Peramuna. And with the support of these SLPP MPs, what we see is the patronage politics based electoral machines of the SLPP MPs backing Wickramasinghe, shifting away from the SLPP. Now, the second main presidential candidate is from the Samaga Jana Balawegaya, and the candidate is Sajith Premadasa. The SJB occupies a position that is able to accommodate crossovers from a wide spectrum of parties. The SJB is therefore a broad tent party, having recently formed the broad alliance, the Samagi Jana Sandhanaya. Now, the SJB, one of the reasons it's able to do this, to form a broad tent party, is because it has been able to occupy a relatively middle ground in comparison to the more economically right establishment that Wickramasinghe represents and the more left anti-establishment camp that the MPP represents. On the economic front, the SJB, through its leader Sajith Premadasa, has been cultivating an image of a pro-poor leader, tapping into his father, the former President Ranasinghe Premadasa, tapping into Ranasinghe Premadasa's legacy. At the same time, however, the party also, through its economic team, portrays a technocratic and business-savvy front. While the SJB's economic program is slightly left of center to that of the current government, it is more or less an alternative to its liberal economic policies. On policies such as, say, tax or other reforms that qualify for IMF funding, the SJB has been consistent that it will work closely with the IMF while negotiating with the IMF to reduce the economic burden on the poor. On democratic freedoms, the SJB has generally been vocal in its opposition to reforms which threaten them. And the party also appears to have provided a more unifying space for ethnic minorities, evident in its backing by key Muslim and Tamil political parties and actors. Now, the third main presidential candidate is the NPP, the National People's Power candidate, Anura Kumara Disanayake. Now, the NPP is a political alliance in which its main party is the Communist-Leninist JVP. And the JVP emerged as the main beneficiary of the Aragale in 2022 as it shot up to popularity after being able to capture only around 3% of the vote in previous elections. On economic policy with the NPP, we see some duality between the JVP's strong anti-IMF stance and the more moderate position that the NPP is trying to occupy. And this duality reflects its attempt to appeal to a broader section of the aspirant middle and business classes, which arguably previously supported the Gotabaya presidency in 2019. That being said, speaking of the duality of the NPP, it's not the only party in which these contradictions are. All political campaigns often show these signs of contradictions. Now, the NPP, very quickly on its economic policy, it has a statist narrative of economic growth, prioritizing industrialization, manufacturing, supporting local businesses, and agricultural productivity. And on this end, therefore, the NPP represents the social mobility of a certain aspirational class that voted in Gotabaya Rajapaksa in 2019. Now, the governance model that the NPP promises is perhaps what makes it stand out the most out of the three candidates. Much of its legitimacy also comes from this narrative, where the NPP advocates for good and clean governance, promising to end corruption, recover stolen money, and ensure a meritocratic system. Addressing a key demand of the Aragale, NPP has also championed being inclusive of women, youth, and the disabled, and mobilized their support. All parties are again doing this, but the NPP appears to be doing this slightly more successfully. And this is significant because in this election, the number of new voters is estimated to be at 1.1 million. And kind of analysis shows that the NPP is likely to capture this youth vote. Finally, the NPP's campaign narrative campaign rhetoric attracts an anti-establishment angry vote. And this appeal to an angry vote also sometimes dovetails with heavy-handed assurances of justice being delivered to an oppressed people, signifying the populist mandate that the NPP arguably takes over from Gotabaya Rajapaksa. The us versus them rhetoric that we also see within the NPP's political campaign prevents the NPP from forming alliances with any of the other mainstream political parties. And this stance could be an attempt by the NPP to, of course, be different from the JVP in a sense. As we know, the JVP in its coalition politics has backed or been in government with political groups across the ideological spectrum. So now that I've talked about the main political parties and candidates for the presidential elections in Sri Lanka, I will very quickly go through the smaller political parties. As I mentioned before, because this is a close race between three candidates, the impact of smaller parties on the final result is increased significantly. With the SLPP recently declared Namal Rajapaksa as its candidate, and fielding another member of the Rajapaksa family as a candidate is a sign that whatever understanding between Wickremesinghe and the Rajapaksa family appears to have ended for now. Significantly, the upcoming election will test the Rajapaksa family's electoral viability, and especially the staying appeal of Mahinda Rajapaksa, in the context of having been severely delegitimized by the Aragale. Moving on to the minority parties, when we look at the Northern Tamil vote, one of the developments that we observed is that a common Tamil candidate has been proposed by some smaller Tamil parties and civil society organizations. This candidate's name is former ITAC MP P. Arya. However, it is important to note that the two main Tamil political Tamil parties and alliances, which is the TNA and the All Ceylon Tamil Congress, they have not yet backed either the common candidate or any of the main candidates. Both President Wickremesinghe and SJB appear attractive to this voter bloc due to historical affinities, and the MPP arguably has not forged strong relations with this constituency. When we look at the Hill Country Tamils and the parties that represent them, the CWC we see is leaning towards President Wickremesinghe with the Tamil Progressive Alliance, having declared its support for the SJB. With the main Muslim parties, the Sri Lanka Muslim Congress and All Ceylon Muslim Congress, again, it's not very clear, but our reading is that it is most likely to back the SJB. This is driven by an emerging perception of the SJB leading, and also due to the Muslim community's anger and distrust with the SLPP. As we remember, during the Gotabaya government, its COVID-19 policy that violated Muslim burial rights, as well as a general sense of insecurity that Muslim community feels during the Rajapaksa government, and Wickremesinghe having allied with the Rajapaksas in July 2022. Finally, among the smaller parties are the Sarvajana Balaya and the People's Struggle Alliance. Now, the emergence of these two parties are very interesting and important because we argue that they emerge in the context of a emerging liberal consensus in Sri Lanka's political landscape. The Sarvajana Balaya, whose presidential candidate is Dilip Jayabira, who was a key insider in the 2019 Gotabaya Rajapaksa electoral campaign. Now, Sarvajana Balaya is trying to capture the left nationalist space that was left open since the fall of Rajapaksa ideological politics in 2022. Dilip Jayabira is backed by a group of Sinhala nationalist and small left parties who provided the core ideological markers of the Rajapaksa brand of left nationalism. It has an anti-IMF, strong anti-India narrative, alongside opposing state-owned enterprise privatization. When we move to the other side of the spectrum, also a left party, but not Sinhala nationalist, is the People's Struggle Alliance. This is a new alliance that comprises the Frontline Socialist Party, along with some other left parties and activists who took part in the Aragale. Its presidential candidate is Nuwan Bopage, and the People's Struggle Alliance, the PSA, represents a radical left ideology in its rejection of the IMF program, and it calls for the cancellation of ODS debt. It also favors strong power sharing going beyond the 13th Amendment. Now, these radical left and ultra-nationalist groups, the two that I just described, while electorally unlikely to be significant, they indicate a growing liberal consensus within the three main political camps that I described earlier. And the main impact of these smaller groups is not likely to be during the elections, but it's likely to be on an issue basis after a new government is formed. So in conclusion, I would like to just end with a few words saying that the political campaigns that we see in the lead up to the presidential elections next month, they're happening in a context of a high degree of political polarization. One way to describe it is that voters do not really see it as alternatives, but as enemies. And this will likely to carry on to the post-election context and have a post-election impact. And because of this highly charged atmosphere, and given the post-economic crisis conditions also that we are now facing, it's likely that whatever government that comes into power will face a very serious challenge in managing and in delivering the high expectations that the voters have. So thank you.
Very clear indication of what is going on here on the ground. Three leading political parties, and then of course several other minor political parties. Important factor is there are, I think, over 1 million new voters. In addition to that, as Dr. Kamage mentioned, there are also angry voters. We will have to wait for another couple of weeks to see how the situation evolves and how the decisions eventually crystallizes. With that, I think I can move on to Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, former governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. We will focus on current socio-economic dynamics, robust program for economic recovery. Dr. Kumaraswamy is the former governor of the Central Bank, as I said earlier. He has over 40 years of experience in economic policymaking and advisory roles. His career began at the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, where he worked from 1974 to 1989, including a secondment to the Ministry of Finance and Planning. I don't think I have to say more about Dr. Kumaraswamy, as he is a well-known figure. Over to you, Indrajit, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Greetings to everybody. And let me commence by thanking ISAS and the Pathfinder Foundation for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I'm going to basically look at three areas. One is macroeconomic performance and policies, the poverty dynamics, and addressing corruption vulnerabilities. Now, I'm going to skate through the material very quickly at a high level in order to manage my time. However, if anybody wants further unpackaging of what I say, and a lot of it does require unpackaging, I'd be happy to do so during the Q&A session. Let me start with the macroeconomic performance and policies. The first thing to say is, from a macroeconomic perspective, there has been an extremely impressive turnaround over the last couple of years. If you recall, in the first half of 2022, there were 12-hour power cuts. People had to queue not for hours, but even for days to get their fuel and gas. There were shortages of medicine, etc. I think that picture is very well known, probably to this audience, so I won't dwell anymore on that. But if you look at the situation on the ground today, it is significantly, dramatically different, in fact. So there is a great deal that has gone in the right direction as far as the macroeconomy is concerned. If you look at the indicators, after 6 successive quarters of contraction, the economy has now grown for three quarters up to the first quarter of this year. And I think the second quarter would also have positive growth. So we are getting now positive growth after 6 consecutive quarters of negative growth and a kind of peak to trough decline in the level of GDP of about 11%. And then if you look at the individual indicators such as inflation, it has come down from a peak of 70% in September 2022 to now about 2.5%. The market interest rates have come down from a peak of about 30% to now being below 10%. The fiscal outturn, which has been the main source of instability in the system, has also improved. In 2023, revenue, which has been the biggest problem, actually overperformed. The revenue collected amounted to 11.1% of GDP last year, as against a target of 10.9%. And year to date also, there is overperformance on the revenue front. If you look at the SOE performance, collectively the SOEs are now actually in surplus, largely because of the move to cost-reflective pricing for the Ceylon Electricity Board and the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. These institutions made massive losses, largely because they were compelled to give large subsidies to the population, and the government did not reimburse them for these subsidies, and the losses were then transferred onto the balance sheets of the state banks. So that problem is now being resolved, and there is cost-reflective pricing, which has, of course, pushed up the cost of electricity and fuel for the people, but it has improved the overall balance sheet of state-owned enterprises. On the external front, the current account of the balance of payment, which has been in deficit for many years, is now in surplus. And perhaps most impressively, has been the build-up in the gross external reserves of the country. On the day that Sri Lanka declared its debt standstill, that is the 12th of April 2022, usable reserves were only about 20 million usable reserves in a country which has an import bill of about 18 to 20 billion per annum and debt servicing of between 5 to 6 billion an annum. So that, and the rule of thumb is that you should have about 3 months worth of import cover in your reserves. But we were down to less than 1 day, down the day that we declared the debt standstill. But that figure now, from usable reserves of only 20 million, usable gross reserves are now about 5.6 billion, but about 1.4 billion of that is a swap arrangement with the People's Bank of China, which is not currently usable. If you net that out, it's still a little over 4 billion. So we've gone from 20 million to 4 billion in terms of the reserve buildup. So in fact, I think the central bank deserve, and the governor and his team deserve a great deal of credit. A, for the way they've controlled inflation through very decisive monetary policy, and B, because they have been able to purchase dollars from the market to build up reserves. And I should say also the Treasury team needs to be given credit for now beginning to turn around the fiscal outturn. And the president, as the finance minister, has given political leadership to this process. So this is all very impressive, and it is also reflected in the relatively smooth implementation of the extended fund facility from the IMF. 2 reviews have been successfully completed, and 3 disbursements have been received. And just a week before last, there was an IMF team in town to have a kind of a health check for the economy, because the 3rd review is due in September, but I suspect that might get disrupted a little bit by the election. So I think they came early to see how the economy was faring. And if you read the press release, it is very positive. All the quantitative targets have been met, and the structural benchmarks have also been met, some of them with some delay, but they've all been met. So all the targets have been met. So in terms of the macroeconomic management, there has been a very impressive turnaround. One other thing to say on the macro side is the debt restructuring. Again, significant progress has been made. The domestic debt optimization has been completed. That agreements have been reached with the Official Creditor Committee and the Exim Bank of China. On the commercial creditor side, there is still a little bit more to do. There is a framework agreement with the Ad Hoc Committee of Bondholders, but there are a few things outstanding. One is the IMF has to confirm that this framework agreement with the international sovereign bondholders actually is aligned with the IMF's debt sustainability analysis, i.e., does this deal allow Sri Lanka to achieve debt sustainability? That confirmation has to come from the IMF. And secondly, the Official Creditor Committee has to be satisfied that the deal reached with the commercial creditors is comparable with the deal that has been completed with the official creditors. So these couple of things are outstanding. Hopefully, they'll be done, completed fairly quickly. There was a couple of sentences in the IMF's press release which said that they have actually completed their assessment of the framework agreement with the commercial creditors, with the bondholders, and that they have shared that assessment with the national authorities, and have also, with the permission of the government, shared it with the advisors to the private creditors, that is Rothschilds. So hopefully, I mean, there is a little bit to do, but hopefully it will get done fairly quickly. So if you look at, the macro indicators, you look at the IMF program, you look at debt restructuring, things have progressed very well or are very close to completion in the case of debt restructuring. But that little bit still needs to be done, and we need to remember that. But now, there is a big caveat, and that is, we have done the stabilization part of IMF programs well in the past. Sri Lanka has had 17 IMF programs, right? But in the past, while we've started well in terms of implementing the IMF program, when elections approached, the discipline went, and we went back to square one. So we have had repeating bouts of macroeconomic stress, repeated bouts of macroeconomic stress over the last 30, 40 years, which is why Sri Lanka has had 17 IMF programs. So we haven't really got over the problem completely as yet. In fact, the IMF consistently says the Sri Lankan economy is still on a knife edge. Significant progress has been made, but there is much more to do. And two things that need to be done is to, one, sustain the progress made so far in terms of macroeconomic stabilization, and secondly, to secure robust economic recovery. So I'm going to address those two issues quickly now. One, in terms of sustaining the macroeconomic stability that has been gained, we need to understand what has caused these repeated bouts of macroeconomic stress. The root cause has invariably been the government's fiscal operations. Unsustainable budget deficits pump excess demand, aggregate demand into the economy. And that is then compounded by fiscal dominance in monetary policy. The central bank would undertake deficit financing, which helped to pump aggregate demand into the system, excess aggregate demand in the system. Central bank also then suppressed interest rates through administrative measures to bring down the yield curve, which led to increased or unsustainable levels of credit expansion. Again, pumps excess demand, aggregate demand into the system. And altogether, this creation of excess aggregate demand, one, fuels inflation, and two, leaks into imports and brings big pressure on the current accounts of the balance of payments. This has been a repeating cycle, time and again. So why are things different this time? Are things different this time? And I would argue, yes, they are different, or they can be different, because clear frameworks are now being set out, and they're being embedded in the law. And being embedded in the law is an important differentiation, because between 2016 and 2019, there was also an IMF program, an extended fund facility. And a lot of the things that have been introduced now were being introduced then. But then in 2020 really, there was a complete 180-degree reversal. When all that was being undertaken was basically rejected, and we flipped and did a complete policy reversal. But now it's going to be much more difficult, because these reforms that are being introduced are being embedded in the law. So what are these reforms, and how are they being embedded in the law? The reforms, for instance, as I said, the budget is the main source of instability. Now there are much tighter fiscal rules. We had a Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, which was introduced in 2002, but it was very ineffective, because the targets were 10 years down the line, and every time we got near the target, Parliament with a simple majority pushed the target back. But this time, there have been annual targets. You have to have a 2.3% of GDP primary surplus in the budget next year, and then it is tapered down to 2% going forward. So it's an annual target that has to be met. You can't, it's not 10 years ahead and then you can kind of shift it around. Every year, you have to have a primary surplus of 2%, about 2% of GDP. Also, there is a target on primary expenditure, that is expenditure minus interest payments, has a cap of 13% of GDP. So your whole budgetary framework is there. There are targets which tie the hands of the government in terms of what it can do in terms of fiscal profligacy. This is different. Of course, the governments can change laws. But at least now you have to go to Parliament and argue why you are going to change the laws. And it gives the opportunity for the opposition and the country at large. It's very crucial that these advances that are being made in terms of having clear frameworks and embedding them in the law, it's protected. It's protected by business associations, civil society, academics. Everybody needs to understand what is being done, and what is being done needs to be sustained and protected. So that is on the side of the fiscal operation. On monetary policy, as I said, there was fiscal dominance, and the central bank just helped the government to pump more aggregate demand into the system. Now, there is no treasury presence in the governance structure of the central bank. The central bank is not permitted by law to lend to the government. The participation in the primary auctions for treasury bills is being phased out and will be eliminated. And also, there is a flexible inflation targeting framework that has been adopted in the law as the framework for monetary policy formulation. And that is a data-dependent, forward-looking framework that is now being put in place to set interest rates. So you can't now administratively put a cap on it. For instance, in 2020, a cap of 5% was put on the one-year treasury bill rate, which shifted the whole yield curve down and created unsustainable expansion in credit, which, as I said, then led to inflation and balance of payments pressure. So you can't do any of that. Central bank governance has been given greater autonomy, and the central bank has now got a data-driven and forward-looking framework for setting monetary policy. And the third area, and that is basically embedded, the fiscal improvements have been embedded in the Public Finance Management Act, which was passed in Parliament, I think, a couple of weeks ago. And the central bank, greater autonomy for the central bank, and the flexible inflation targeting framework as the basis of monetary policy formulation, that is embedded in the new Central Bank Act. And the third act that is also significant is the act that has established the Public Debt Management Office. Historically, public debt management was fragmented. The Treasury, the Operations Department, the External Resources Department, and the Central Bank manage different aspects of the public debt management. The external resources did bilateral and multilateral debt, Treasury operations did syndicated loans, and the central bank did international sovereign bonds. So it was not easy to have a holistic strategy. In fact, a medium-term debt management strategy was put together and published. If you can Google it, Sri Lanka medium-term debt management strategy, which was published in March 2019, but that was also set aside, as was the Active Liability Management Act, which gave the central bank more tools to manage the debt. But now all this is going to be shifted to one entity, and it should make it much easier to have a much more strategic approach to debt management in the future. So this is, again, a significant improvement. So as I said, the frameworks have been improved. It's embedded in the law, and hopefully we will not keep making the same mistakes again and again as far as macroeconomic policy is concerned. I think it was Einstein who said that the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing and to expect different outcomes, which is what we have been guilty over the last 30, 40 years. And I think this time around, hopefully, we have tied our hands and we will be able to get away from that. So that is an important difference. Right. Now, but why do we, so if all this has been put in place, why do we say the economy is still on a knife edge and that we cannot be complacent? And that is because we cannot be sure of achieving debt sustainability. That is, we cannot be sure that we can pay all our debts and finance our imports without having growth of 5% or more. What is being done on the debt restructuring is like the country is being given a kind of an oxygen tent. We don't have to service any bilateral debt, interest or capital, till 2028. We only service interest on commercial debt till 2028 if this agreement that's been reached is actually finalized. So, but by 2028, we need to be able to service all our debt and finance all the imports, right? That we will, is that oxygen tent will be taken away, and we have to be able to breathe on our own. And that is where it, and you can't do that unless you get 5% growth in a sustained way in the period ahead. And for that, we have not been able to get the right growth model, the right structure for the economy. We have not been able to create an economy, to undertake the structural reforms, to create an economy which is outward oriented, competitive, and drives growth and employment generation through export transformation. President J.R. Jayawardeneh, when he opened the economy in 1977, said that we must export or perish. That is a slogan that is actually completely never, and Daya is the expert in this area. We have come nowhere near doing the right things to give credence to that slogan. So now we have no option. We have to do it. We can't get sustained growth of 5%, which we need to get out of the deficit.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah.
The time allocated to you is almost over.
All right. Okay. I'll really skip through the rest.
Okay.
That's one. So we have, let me say that. So we have not done the structural reforms. We have not done the critical structural reforms related to the investment climate, investment promotion, trade liberalization, trade agreements, trade facilitation, education, training, skill development, a whole range of things which we've known for years. Why have we not done it? Because one, the gestation period for the fruition of structural reforms tends to be rather long, and politicians want results quickly, and they don't. So there is no political will often to do it. The other thing is, while these reforms benefit many, there are a few losers. And the losers have a much louder voice because they're usually politically connected. So these structural reforms are consistently blocked. This time we have no choice. If we want to get out of the oxygen tent and still be able to breathe and not have these repeating cycles of debt restructuring and austerity as countries like Argentina have, we have no choice but to change our growth model, make it based on export transformation, and that's the only way we can get out of it. On poverty, the headcount poverty has gone up from 15%. The most recent estimates are 30%. The UNDP did a survey where multidimensional vulnerability affects 50% of the population, little over 50% of the population. How do we deal with it? We have to have an effective cash transfer program, which is not politicized, and the Aswasma program, which has replaced Samruddhi, cannot be as politicized as Samruddhi was. It should be better targeted. And the budgetary allocation has been tripled from 70 billion to 200 billion. That's a good thing, but it has to be now targeted well. But in the long run, we have to have an inclusive growth strategy. And to make the growth strategy inclusive, two areas require priority. One is agricultural modernization, to move away from low productivity, low income agriculture, which we have to a significant extent, and also MSME development. And for that, we need to have to really clear the marketing channels for MSMEs and to focus on hooking them up into supply chain. Finally, on tackling corruption vulnerabilities, the government has to be given credit for requesting the IMF to undertake a governance diagnostic assessment. Now, that assessment has 15 recommendations. The government has got an action plan to implement those recommendations. It is now up to the whole of society to hold the government to account in terms of implementing those 15 recommendations. Finally, let me just say, really the slogan for the future has to be consensus and consistency. We can't every 5 years completely change our policy framework. If India had a massive, as we are having a regional orientation, India had a massive crisis in 1991. But since then, there has been a consensus between the BJP and Congress on the overall economic policy framework. And they've never been back to the IMF since. We have these constant reversals and changes which leads to lack of predictability and consistency in policies. So we have to somehow make sure that there is consensus around some of these things that I've said, the things that we have gained, the gains that we've made, they need to be secured. We need to build consistency, consensus around them. And without that, as I said, we have to continue with the macro stability. We have to change our growth model. Without that, we could end up being countries like Argentina, who are constantly having to have debt restructurings and austerity packages. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I've gone over my limit.
No problem. Thank you very much for that very informative information that you have provided. So it seems that so far we have done well. The question is between now and 2028, where we are going to be. If no structural reforms are introduced and give effect to, then of course we will be in trouble. That is the gist of the presentation made by Dr. Kumaraswamy. And now the first session of ours, which focused on political landscape and the economic dynamics. The first session is over. We have a short duration for discussions, questions and answers. And time is 1:56, almost 2 o'clock. So we have about 10 to 15 minutes, not more than that, before we start the third presentation. So if there are any questions, please go ahead. You have about 15 minutes till 2:50. Well, it seems that our two presenters have made it easy for the audience to understand what's going on, both in political as well as economic fields. There are no questions. We can move on to the next subject. Yeah. Okay, we have one brave soldier from our side, Pathfinder side. Please go ahead.
Dr. Kumaraswamy, this is Gayatri. Just, I'm sure this question everyone has. You mentioned that obviously we've seen, it's been obviously impressive turnaround. Despite that, why is there still so much dissatisfaction in the country?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. A couple of things. One is, while inflation has come down from a peak of 70% down to 2.5% last month, the price level, they have to differentiate between the inflation, which measures the increase in prices, and the price level. When you had inflation as high as 70%, the price level has gone up dramatically in the last 2 years. So people and their income, people's incomes have not gone up anything like as much. I see there are various salary increases being given now, but people's incomes have not kept pace, come anywhere near keeping pace with the increase in prices. So the rate of increase of prices come down, but the price level is still much higher than it was, and incomes have not kept up. So that, I think, and there's been a squeeze on affordability through one, inflation, and two, taxes. So affordability has been a problem. And so that, I think, has given dissatisfaction. And, I kind of rushed through it, but poverty, this improvement in the macro picture is not really being felt by about 60% of the population. As I said, the price level is still high. Incomes are not keeping up, and they have not felt that. So clearly we had to have this improvement in the macro. We have to take the tough measures to make sure that the macro stability comes about. But now you have to do the growth agenda to make sure that higher value of jobs are created, the productivity is increased, which permits higher levels of wages. So all that has, the much more difficult part of the agenda is still ahead of us. And if we don't do it, I don't know how long people will be patient. Now, I know we have instability around the South Asia, but probably the most pertinent comparison is Kenya. Kenya has had a similar situation to us. They've had an IMF program and they've had increase in taxes. People have actually got onto the streets and rioted. The Sri Lankans have been remarkably patient so far. But you have to, as I said, this is where we are still on a knife edge because we have to start doing the tough things in terms of structural reforms to get a new growth model and have sustained growth of 5%. And in the process, create not only more jobs, but also more higher value jobs, given the educated nature of our population. So there's a lot more to do. We are on a knife edge, and even politically, in terms of political stability, in terms of social need, we are on a knife edge, and there's a lot more to do.
I think there is another person who wishes to raise a question or make a comment. Prasanga?
Yes, actually, by Dr. Chandra Jayaratne. What about the equating the DDO impact of EPF members with the ISB?
Well, in terms of burden sharing of the debt restructuring, from what I can remember, we had to reduce our gross financing needs from about 34% to 13%. So most of that adjustment has been done through the tax system. But there is about 5% of the adjustment, 4% of the adjustment had to be done through, 4% of GDP of the adjustment had to be done through debt restructuring. So 2.5% of that is being borne by the external creditors and 1.5% by domestic creditors. So it is not comparable because in fact, there is less of a burden on the EPF than there is on the external creditors in terms of the adjustment that has to be made. So we don't want to do 2.5% on the domestic debt so that we are equal to the external creditors.
Thank
And
you.
of the 1.5% adjustment, that's but borne by domestic debt, 1% was borne by the central bank through the conversion of its treasury bill holdings into long-term bonds. And 0.5% of the burden has been borne by the EPF.
And there is another question that also Dr. Chandra Jayaratne. How can we ensure a free and fair election and a peaceful handover of power?
And that's above my pay grade. I think that's for Roger.
Yeah, just very briefly to answer that. I saw a report by the Election Commission of Sri Lanka, which documents the kind of election violations that are happening. Probably Dr. Sarah would be, I think, best placed to speak about this in the next section as well. But that report basically said that the greatest number of violations are coming from the state abuse of its resources in campaigns. But we do see violations from all three main parties, but the state predominantly. And they've also reported, for now, a few cases of election violence as well. So I think that both the Election Commission as well as civil society groups such as PAPREL and others will be trying their best to work in a concerted manner to address this issue. In terms of, and just one more thing I would like to say there is that to ensure this, of course, we need the participation of law and order. And the recent fiasco with the IGP, Inspector General Police, and the vacancy of that seat. So we understand that it wouldn't necessarily obstruct election duties.
Can I read it? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes. So we understand that it wouldn't necessarily obstruct because there's another person that has been now taken over those duties. And then finally, in terms of the free and fair handover of power, I think that Sri Lanka's past has shown us that peaceful handover has happened. And so we can hope that this continues. Yeah, thank you.
There is another question. Prasanga? Yeah. Okay.
To Dr. Kumaraswamy and the other panelists, immediately following the presidential election, parliamentary election are anticipated in Sri Lanka. In view of traditional ideological perceptions of the SLPP, which is now split into three among several presidential candidates, so do you foresee political will from this group to supporting the IMF-led reforms in the medium term, observing how slow and resistant the SLPP political class is to such a reform? From Chandra Kankanamge, Sri Lanka.
Okay. From my perspective, I think at the moment, we have no option but to stay on course with an IMF program. Because if we don't have an IMF program, not only will the IMF money not come, but the ADB and the World Bank money also will be suspended. And the bilateral donors who have started their suspended projects, I suspect will again suspend their projects because everybody wants some certification that we are on our way out of this debt crisis. They are not going to give us their public money from their taxpayers, if there isn't some kind of external certification that our policies will lead to debt sustainability. So if we get out of the IMF program, we will be back to where we were in 2022, where nobody gave us money. You know, the central bank set out a roadmap in October 2021, how lots of money was going to come into the country. As I said, on the 12th of April, we had $20 million in our reserves. So we will go back to that situation, basically, because nobody is willing to give us money, will be willing to give us money, unless the IMF keeps certifying that our policies are sustainable and that we will at some point reach that sustainability and we'll be able to pay back the money that they're giving us. So that is one part of the story, right? So we have to have an IMF program. But it does not mean that everything is immutable. What is given is the overall parameters of the program and the key targets within the program. However, the how part of it, how you achieve those targets, the sovereign governments will have the capacity to negotiate. For instance, on taxes, you may get a government which wants to put a much higher burden on the wealthy and reduce the burden on the lower and middle classes. Now, that kind of thing you can negotiate. That's possible. But you can't change the overall parameters. The overall targets are there. But there is scope to the how part of it. What you have to do is given. How you achieve that can be negotiated by a government which comes in with a new mandate. But as I said, if we don't have an IMF program, we can forget about external support. We'll be in the situation of that roadmap, where we had this roadmap of lots of money coming in and nothing came.
Very quickly, if I could add on to that, in terms of whether the SLPP, with its past ideological baggage, would support IMF programs, I guess the answer is in the current government. And so, like I said during the presentation, what we see within the main camps is a growing liberal consensus. And so, even with the NPP, even as at times they speak of the neo-colonial IMF and all of that, I think even they understand that pragmatically they need to adhere to an IMF program.
Actually, that's a very important point Rajni makes, because nobody, to my knowledge, has said that we don't want the IMF. They have said that they will renegotiate the program. As I said, I don't think you can renegotiate the parameters, the targets, etc., but you can renegotiate the burden sharing within the program.
Good. Thank you very much. Anybody else?
Yes, we have another question actually. How crucial is China's involvement in the next government's foreign policy planning?
I think we should, maybe Dr. Chulani is, I think, poised to speak about this in the next panel, so maybe we can do that.
Okay, there is another question. Samantha Priyadarshana, dear Dr. Kumaraswamy, Dr. Gamage, in order to maintain the macro stability, we need to maintain the political stability as well. But with the upcoming election period as a country, do you think we will be able to have a consistent policies?
I'll let Rajini start and I'll talk after her.
Sure. Just very briefly, I think towards the end, what I was trying to get to it is that despite the main political camps demonstrating a liberal consensus, we are seeing some of the more end of the spectrum parties already emerging. The Sarvajana Balaya and the PSN, they can come up in many different versions. So in terms of policy consistency, even as there is liberal consensus, what we can expect in a future government is that when certain issues come up, whether it is tax or so on and so forth, on an issue basis, we can expect to see a mobilization, a strong mobilization that might go counter to this liberal consensus. And that's where we can start to see, the political contestations get heightened and even possibly to the extent of policy reversals.
If I may, exactly, we have no choice but to achieve that consensus. If we don't, there will be significant problems. Let me say this, why is it that people need to ask us, we need to ask ourselves as a people, why have we gone to the IMF 17 times? And what are the mistakes that have been made? And that's what I try to talk about. And we are trying to put those right. Should we now undermine that process? I was in the central bank for 3.5 years this last time around. And for much of that period, Sri Lanka was the only country in the whole of Asia that had an IMF program. Pakistan actually is not considered part of the Asia Pacific because they don't want to be in the same constituency as India, so they hived off to the Middle East. So Pakistan is another country like us. But if you take the rest of the Asia Pacific region, for most of those 3.5 years, for a brief period, Mongolia had a program. We were the only country. Why is it that why has the rest of Asia been able to manage without the IMF? But we get ourselves into a mess time and again and have to rush off to the IMF 17 times. So as I said, if you keep doing the same thing again and again and expect different outcomes, it's insanity. That is what Einstein said, and he was right. So this time, at least, we need to do things differently. And we have started doing it differently. We need to sustain it and need to do the tough things on the structural side. Not just maintaining macro stability. People ask me, what grade do you give yourselves for your time in the central bank? I said, well, if I'm honest, I would say the treatment was good, but in the end, the patient died because we didn't get growth. Because we got macro stability, but growth didn't come because from, I think, the local government elections, the government became, at the apex of the government, became totally dysfunctional. There was a no confidence motion against the prime minister. Then there was a change in government, which was deemed constitutionally not kosher. Then we had the Easter bombings. So there were a series of events which meant that there was no confidence. Sentiment and confidence was poor. And so we didn't get investment, domestic or foreign. So we have to political stability is crucial. Without political stability, people won't invest. Without investment, actually, we might get some growth this year and next year, partly because of base effects, partly also there's a lot of unutilized capacity. Because of the crisis, a lot of people couldn't get their imports, etc., because of the restrictions. Now, as the restrictions are removed, there'll be higher capacity utilization. And for maybe another 2, 3, maybe even 4 quarters, we might get pretty good growth. But after that, we will have to get new investment. That is when the challenge will come. Can we create the conditions to get new investment? For that, you need political stability. You need macro stability, both.
Yes, that's it. Well, I think we don't have any more questions or comments. And that brings the first session to a closure. We have the second session. Dr. Pakisothi Saravanamuthu is here to discuss current socio-political undercurrents addressing root causes and deconstructing populism. Dr. Saravanamuthu is the founder and executive director of the Center for Policy Alternatives in Sri Lanka. He serves on the Foreign Policy Advisory Group and the board of the Lakshmi Chadragam Institute for International and Strategic Studies. He is a renowned expert on governance and peace in Sri Lanka, frequently presenting at international conferences and contributing to both international and local media. Over to you, Dr. Saravanamuthu. You have the floor. 15 minutes, please. Microphone, please. Microphone.
Thank you, Bernard. And let me begin by thanking Pathfinder Foundation, ISAS, for inviting me to partake in this discussion. Just aside, I'm no longer a member of the Foreign Policy Advisory Group or of the Lakshmi Chadragama board. Anyway, so my brief here is to talk about deconstructing populism and talking about current political trends. I think the first thing that I want to say is that successive governments in Sri Lanka have nurtured, encouraged, or succumbed to this notion of a culture of entitlement amongst the population. And what I mean by that culture of entitlement is that we look after people effectively, or at least formally, from whom we don't incentivize them to use whatever initiative and enterprise they might have to go out and do things on their own. So we have free education, we have free medical service, and we have something like 1.5 million people on the government payroll, which is entirely unsustainable, surely, for a population of 22 million Sri Lankans, and given our general economic performance. Practically every election that we've had, political parties have gone on the stump and promised 10,000 more jobs. And for the existing people in the public service, they have offered 10,000 more rupees in terms of salary increases. It's still happening even today. Now, that has to be stopped. Now, there are two ways, of course, doing it. One, of course, is a pretty brutal way of saying you're going to retrench people and let them sink or swim. The other way, of course, is thinking of ways in which one can retrain and reskill them. Because we can't just let them go out and become destitute, as it were. We need to retrain and reskill them to be able to take part in a profitable employment in the country. Now, why is populism, which focuses so much on sovereignty and rather outdated versions of sovereignty, so strong? I think there are two reasons. One is trying to unpack that by now cliché about the singular community in this country being a majority with a minority complex, and that they have to be cosseted and protected within Sri Lanka as their motherland, as it were. And that leads to, therefore, pandering to whatever demands they have politically. The other, I think, is a general proposition that I see that is prevalent globally as well. It's not dissimilar to Donald Trump's Make America Great Again. It is a backlash against globalism, against globalization. People in this country fear that every other single country is going to take them over strategically as well as economically. If you look at the way in which we have responded in terms of popular opinion to any closer association with India. It has been a visceral fear that India is going to come and gobble us up. There was a story that, we would have Indian barbers cutting our hair on the streets of Colombo kind of thing, without any consideration of what is the long-term advantage, economically perhaps, and indeed in other ways as well, of a closer alignment with India. A closer alignment with another country does not entail losing one's sovereignty. That notion of sovereignty dating from the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 or whatever is totally outdated. It does not hold sway anywhere, and not even in the United States of America, considered to be the strongest country in the world. So what does this mean? We have to change the animating culture of governance and politics in this country. Without doing that, we can pass, and our laws are not all that bad. Some are pretty grotesque and inappropriate, but our laws in general are not all that bad. The problem is the implementing political, the animating political culture. As Indrajit pointed out, that Finance Management Act, there were targets set, but Parliament kept increasing the targets. What is the point of doing that? There is no sense of discipline. There is no sense of planning in terms of where we want to get to. And the reason for that, I think, is because successive political parties have pandered to the demands of the electorate rather than taking seriously the point that leadership is about putting out an agenda there and persuading people to follow it. Not like that old story of the politician who stared out the window and saw a group of people going in one direction, and he turned around and said to the person standing next to him, "Oh, those are my followers, I must go and see where they're going." That is the problem. In terms of the political leadership, is extremely short-sighted and committed to this toxic notion of wanting to stay in power all the time. And that, therefore, requires a conversation, particularly in the rural areas. We have done surveys, and we have found that over the last two and a half years, that the understanding of the IMF deal, the reason for going to the IMF deal, the reasons for making sacrifices are growing incrementally in terms of, yes, we too have to make sacrifices if we're going to get ourselves out of this mess, and it's increasing in the rural areas. The middle classes in this country, yes, are being squeezed. They suddenly got up and realized that they had to pay taxes. Perhaps it hit them by surprise. And now they're feverishly looking around of how to get out of the country. Those who stay behind are the ones that one has to focus on. And it does require serious, honest conversation with them. Now, in terms of the political options that we have available, I just want to focus on the new kids on the block, as it were, in terms of aspirants to power, i.e. the NPP. The NPP's argument is that we have never been given a chance. We've given the other two a chance for 75 years. They messed this country up. It's now our turn. And anti-corruption. They say that they will do something, definitely do something on corruption. The NPP leaders that I have spoken to concede that there is not much that they can do on corruption where the money has gone out of the country. It will take a long, long time, a la Marcos and all of that. They will go after the people in the country. Now, I would submit to you that if the JVP won an election and formed the government, if they did not put a big wig behind bars for corruption, they're going to face a backlash. They're going to face a backlash which will be, look, you are just like all of the other bourgeois parties. You cut deals and you don't do what you say you will do. That backlash will probably come from those elements from 88, 89, who were the more extreme elements, and perhaps now from sections of the FSP, the Peretugami, etc. And it will be an Aragalia very different from the one that we had before. It will be violent. It will be violent. If we look at our history, given our populism and all of that, every 20 to 25 years, we cleanse our polity with blood. We did it with the two JVP insurgencies, with the 30-year civil war. Yes, the Aragalia was different, but in terms of the Aragalia, and perhaps the jury is still out, it's only one real demand that succeeded. That was getting the Rajapaksas out of government, not out of politics. And with regard to system change, yes, in private, they will all tell you, for example, that they support an abolition of the executive presidency, but they haven't come out and said so. And I think, therefore, the next government that comes in has to, well, political parties, I think, or at least the three main ones, have to commit themselves to a minimum agenda of reform which can re-establish a functioning, feasible social contract in this country. They need to commit themselves to that minimal agenda, and the new government probably ought to form a national government and come up with a 100 days program where it hits the road running and takes control of the important decisions that have to be made. Otherwise, we are going to have this notion that we are such a precious, everyone wants, if we don't kind of set up our own barriers and look inward, we are never going to survive as an independent country. That has to be got rid of. That culture of entitlement, that notion that, yes, we have a state to look after us, we have a government which takes on that mandate to do so, and that's what's important. And to hell with all the other consequences. That has to change, and change it must. So in conclusion, what I will say is this, is that we have three major choices as far as a change of government is concerned. We have the crucial challenge of redefining, redesigning our social contract. We therefore have to get entirety of society, or most of it, to come behind the founding principles of what we want as a country. Where do we want to go? The current president talks about 2048, 100 years of independence. Okay, let's take that as a landmark. In that period, we're going to have, last year it was about 300,000 Sri Lankans of a working age that went out of the country. That figure is going to increase. We're going to end up with about over 2 million Sri Lankans outside. They will send money back to their aging parents, presumably, for about 10 years. And if they get a job outside, they're not coming back before 10 years. We're also moving into a world in which artificial intelligence is going to increasingly become important and take over jobs. We really need to look at our agricultural policy. Agriculture takes up a fair chunk of our labor force, but it contributes the least to the GDP. We need to look at something like the Paddy Lands Act, because this Govi Raja myth is a myth. So we have very, very hard decisions to take, and to avoid that backlash, to ensure that those decisions are taken with at least a minimum consensus of the people in this country, we need to work together. And Also, I think fundamental in doing this is we have to recognize that Sri Lanka is a country made up of many peoples. We have to found it on a notion of unity in diversity. We have to recognize the contribution of all the minorities and all the people in this country to its future. And therefore, we need to elect a government that recognizes, acknowledges the mistakes of the past, but offers us feasible, rational hope for the future. Thank you.
Dr. Saravaramuthu, for that thought-provoking intervention presentation made by you on current socio-political undercurrents in the country. We now move on to the next item, impact of regional geopolitics on the Sri Lankan elections by Dr. Chulani Attanayake. Dr. Chulani Attanayake is a researcher with expertise in China and South Asia politics, geopolitics and security in the Indo-Pacific, and Sri Lanka's foreign relations. The current research focuses on maritime security and maritime sovereignty of small states with a special focus on the underwater domain. He is currently a sessional lecturer and pursuing a PhD at Swinburne University of Technology, Australia. Prior to joining the university, she was a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, and currently holds an affiliation with the Institute as a non-resident fellow. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for ISAS and Pathfinder for the invitation to be a part of this very interesting discussion. So my focus will be about the geopolitics and how that is going to play a role in Sri Lanka's upcoming election. We often talk about the importance of Sri Lanka's strategic positioning in the Indian Ocean, and at every single discussion we have about Sri Lanka, and how this attracts the interest of many players in the region who are vying to secure economic and strategic interest. And in recent years, Sri Lanka has navigated a complex geopolitical landscape marked by shifting alliances, economic investments, and regional security dynamics. So the country's foreign policy and internal politics are deeply intertwined with these regional contexts, where power plays and economic investments shape its trajectory. So as a result of this, Sri Lanka's election can be profoundly influenced by these developments. There can be external forces who are not only shaping domestic political discourse, but also steering the priorities and policies of Sri Lanka's political parties. So understanding this interplay between regional geopolitics and Sri Lanka's elections provide crucial insight into how global power structures and economic interest mold our democratic process and national strategies. So within the short time I have, I will try to sort of answer two major, one question, that is, what are the major factors or the players in regional geopolitics and how they can impact our upcoming election. I will use three key points for this. First is influence of major players in the region. Second, ethnic and political alignments. And third, regional security concerns. So broadly, there are three major players that we see as influential in Sri Lanka's geopolitics, in geopolitical landscape. First is India. So as the close neighbor and major regional player, India's policy and perceptions can sway Sri Lankan electoral politics, as we have seen many times in the past. Indian interest in Sri Lanka's maritime security, economic relations, ethnic relations often influence election campaigns and voter sentiments. Sri Lanka and India definitely share a multifaceted relationship, which is deeply rooted in shared history, culture, and geography. and their intersections are shaped by centuries of cultural exchanges in trade and common heritage. Despite these enduring ties, the relationship has often been marred by periods of tension and hegemonic behavior on part of India, such as the Indo-Lanka Accord in 1987. And this has at times influenced Sri Lankan domestic politics in ways that have sparked controversies and diplomatic friction. India's subtle influence in domestic politics has resulted in public opposition at times, and at times, India is viewed as intrusive and hegemonic by the wider public. In recent years, particularly following the economic crisis of 2022, public perception of India in Sri Lanka has undergone a notable transformation. This shift is largely attributed to the proactive stance taken by the Indian Prime Minister Modi's neighborhood first policy in the past few years, and also India's active engagement in Sri Lanka's economic and political recovery post-2022 crisis. Now, this crisis in 2022 was a defining moment for Sri Lanka, marked by, as we discussed in this panel as well, shortages of essential goods, widespread civil unrest, and dramatic decline in living standards. Amidst this turmoil, Sri Lanka sought international assistance to navigate the crisis and stabilize the economy. This period became a critical test for India's diplomatic and humanitarian engagement with Sri Lanka. In response to Sri Lanka's dire situation, India extended significant support, including financial assistance, credit lines for essential support, imports, humanitarian aid to alleviate the immediate hardships faced by Sri Lankan populace. India offering of large loans, especially without an IMF program, while other countries halted after Sri Lanka defaulted, made a profound impact on the public opinion. Now, this doesn't mean that there are no concerns. Concerns have emerged about India's growing influence over Sri Lanka's strategic policies, particularly in areas such as defense, energy, and economy. There is fear that this heightened influence might rekindle dominant anti-Indian sentiments. For instance, apprehension about India's strong push for several key projects, like including Adani's renewable energy initiatives, a unique identity card scheme funded by India, and major connectivity projects like electricity grid, gas pipelines, and oil pipelines between two countries. Additionally, there are talks about India seeking a long-term lease for the Trincomalee port, a move that is being compared to China's Hambantota port deal. Now, the second and most controversial player is China. China's expanding influence in Sri Lanka, particularly through significant investment and infrastructure projects like Hambantota port, has become a pivotal factor in shaping the country's electoral landscape. This was particularly notable in 2014 election, where concerns about growing Chinese involvement were seen as a contributing factor to the then incumbent President Mahinda Rajapaksa's defeat. In the aftermath of Sri Lanka's 2022 economic crisis, China's role has come under increased scrutiny, with accusation of debt trap diplomacy gaining traction. Despite maintaining a relatively low profile in recent years, China has still managed to secure critical deals such as the Sinopec fuel distributor station and rights to construct a massive refinery in Hambantota funded by the Chinese capital. These developments underscore Beijing's continued strategic interest in Sri Lanka, even as it faces mounting criticism. China's activities in Sri Lanka have also become a source of tension in regional geopolitics with India. Beijing has repeatedly irked India by sending research vessels to Sri Lanka port, a move that New Delhi views as a threat to its security and stability, and also overall stability in the Indian Ocean region. So in response to, there has been strong response on India's part for this. And as a result, Sri Lanka imposed a 1-year ban in beginning of this year on research ships docking in Colombo for research purposes. Now, however, some Sri Lankan cabinet ministers have indicated that Sri Lanka will revisit this ban in the coming months or towards the end of the year, reflecting the delicate balancing act Sri Lanka must perform between China and India. The third major player is United States, of course. The US stance on human rights, democracy, and regional stability impact Sri Lankan politics. American criticism or support can influence election debates, particularly concerning foreign policy and human rights issues. Its involvement in Sri Lankan election might be viewed positively by those seeking stronger democratic institutions or negatively by those wary of foreign intervention. Its US influence on Sri Lanka's election can be multifaceted, deeply intertwined with democracy and regional stability. One of the most notable instances of US involvement in Sri Lanka during 2022 economic crisis, where it played a crucial role in supporting IMF Day. The IMF program backed by the US was vital in stabilizing Sri Lanka's economy during a period of severe instability. So this support not only helped Sri Lanka ease the immediate economic crisis, but also influenced public perception of the US as a key international partner during times of need. So as a result of this, candidates or parties may use this to their advantage in their election narrative. So these dynamics of different players, external players, have always been evident in Sri Lanka's presidential election, as we saw in 2015. And similarly, we can expect that these can play a major role in 2022 and can sway voters towards candidates who favor either Western-style economic policies or while potentially alienating those who view supporting such external support as compromising Sri Lanka's autonomy. The second key factor that I see as influential is ethnic and political alignment. Regional geopolitics significantly intersect with Sri Lanka's ethnic and political dynamics, particularly in relation to the Sinhala majority government's policies towards Tamil and Muslim minorities. The geopolitical interest of India in particular often influences these policies, reflecting broader regional power struggle. For instance, Tamil political parties in Sri Lanka have historically sought support from the Tamil diaspora and regional powers like in Tamil diaspora and India, especially Tamil Nadu, which shares ethnic and cultural ties with Sri Lankan Tamils. During Sri Lankan War, India's involvement was partly driven by the pressure from Tamil Nadu, which advocated for the rights of the Tamil minority in Sri Lanka. This external support can shape election strategies as seen in the 2015 election when Tamil and Muslim voters played a crucial role in the defeat of Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was perceived as antagonistic towards the minorities. The third and final factor is security and defense. Regional security concerns such as maritime disputes and terrorism significantly can influence election platforms in Sri Lanka. Political parties often shape their campaigns around promises to bolster national security in response to perceived threats from regional powers or to address concerns raised by international actors. For instance, during 2019 presidential election, the Easter Sunday terrorist attack became a central issue, ensuring the victory of then presidential candidate Gotabaya Rajapaksa. So global conflicts such as Palestine-Israel issue or the Russia-Ukraine war might also resonate with specific voter groups. For example, Muslim communities in Sri Lanka might closely follow a party stance on the Palestine-Israel conflict, while broader concerns about global instability due to the Russia-Ukraine war could lead to calls for non-alignment or strategic autonomy in foreign policy. These views reflect how regional and global security dynamics can shape electoral strategies and voter behavior in Sri Lanka. So in conclusion, as Sri Lanka navigates its recovery from an unprecedented economic crisis, the nation finds itself unable to afford to antagonize either India or China or any other international partner, including United States, or the ones that I did not went into deeper, like Japan, Russia, United Kingdom, or European Union. Their support or criticism can sway the public perception, voter behavior, and ultimately election outcome. The intricate relationship between the regional geopolitics and Sri Lanka's electoral politics is evident from the past in how party platforms, voter sentiments, and national policies are shaped. So these are some of the issues that we should pay more attention to when we are listening to our presidential candidates these years. Thank you very much.
That was Dr. Chulani Attanayaka speaking of the impact of regional geopolitics on Sri Lankan elections. With that, the two speakers who made presentations on the session 2 has come to an end, and we have a brief session for discussions. And if there are any questions or comments to be made on the two subjects presented by Dr. Saravanamuthu and Dr. Attanayaka, this is the time to do it. Do we have any?
Yes, we have one question for Dr. Saravanamuthu. The political backlash which will erupt with the NPP-JVP anti-corruption policies. Do you think we have enough time to redefine the social contract, NPP people, before the election?
Sarah, you are muted. Good. Mute again? Mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, good. Thank you.
Yeah, so the question is whether we can get a consensus with regard to a new social contract before a JVP government comes into office. Look, I mean, my point about the issue of corruption and all of that is if a JVP government comes into office, that could be possible. That is the danger. I'm not saying that will definitely happen. I think we do need, irrespective of whether it is the JVP or the Ranil Wickremesinghe or Sajith Premadasa who wins the election, we need that consensus because, as Indrajit pointed out, I mean, we haven't had that consensus, and this chopping and changing has been one of the contributory factors to the economic mess that we have got ourselves into. So we need to have that consensus on overall political stability, and if the three main contenders can look beyond their basic sort of party political support objectives and look to the interests of the country, I think that would be possible. A basic minimum consensus. They can fight about other things. And what I would further recommend is that, look, whoever becomes president, you form a national government for 2.5 years. After that, you can go at each other in preparation for the next election. But 2.5 years to establish the basics.
Okay, I think we left a question from our previous session. How crucial is China's involvement in the next government's foreign policy planning?
No, that was asked.
No, we left it to this
That question
session.
was asked and Chulani.
No. It's
deferred to the next section.
yes.
So it is up to Chulani to come up with a response.
Well, I think I answered that in my presentation as well. When it comes to China, China has been quite quiet in the post-2022 crisis. but it has also managed to get some deals on its part to a certain extent. As I said in my final remark, given our current economic situation, and in general, given our strategic positioning in the Indian Ocean region, we cannot afford to alienate one country or the other. So whether it is China or India, the way forward would be to balance these powers and follow the same strategic hedging that we have been successfully doing in the past so many years in order to maximize our economic and strategic benefit.
Thank you.
And there is another question for Dr. Pakiswati. What is the future of nationalism becoming a false line in future Lankan politics?
A false?
Fault line.
False line.
Fault line. The future Lankan politics.
Well, I must say right from the start that I have never been a nationalist, and I hope I never will, because I see that it is inappropriate and out of sync with the trends in the world today. The borders and the boundaries are disappearing, and any kind of rearguard action to erect them is going to lead to more conflict. And I think the point, again, is that in a multi-ethnic and multi-religious society, if you are a nationalist, you are a nationalist for a specific identity. And those identities will inevitably clash and lead to political instability. We know that is part of the story of what happened to us in the last 30-odd years, and I suppose what is still happening to us. But this is why, in order to prevent that strong resurgence of nationalism, we need to have that conversation between the governed and the governing. In that, people need to understand, rather than take things from top to bottom, people need to understand why we are doing this, what are we doing, what else do we need to do, and what can we do better. So if without that conversation, and given this era of social media, there's a lot of disinformation around. People's minds are being made up overnight. And with regard to social media, we all know people tend to go to what I would call echo chambers. They go to sites which reflect their biases and prejudices. Very rarely do they challenge themselves. So I think it's very, very important that we have this national dialogue. An election provides a wonderful opportunity to talk about the things which we all agree on and the things that we need to do to go forward.
Thank you, Doctor. There is another question from Imran Ahmed. A question for Dr. Sarunamuthu. Given the strong emphasis on the economic recovery, what is the future of reconciliations and the transitional justice process in Sri Lanka likely to be?
Well, yes. I mean, I think because of this particular crisis, there has been an emphasis, a prominence given to the economic dimension, which is obviously very natural. And as a consequence, transitional justice has slid down. However, the danger there is that the diaspora is particularly interested in accountability. And the diaspora are not necessarily going to give up. And therefore, there is the danger that something that has always been happening, that the politics of the North might take a different trajectory to the political towards reconciliation, is to focus on the economic. But I don't think that the economic in itself is going to be sufficient to make this country whole again. So my argument has always been that the two have to go hand in hand. You cannot ignore one at the expense of the other.
There is another question from Chandra Jayaratna. Which party will USA, India, and China support financially and otherwise in the election period?
Let's start with India. As far as the three main contenders are concerned, I don't think India has a problem with any of them. India does not have a problem with the UNP or Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, SJB or NPP. So India is going to be always there. Whether we love them or hate them, we are tied to them in one very important way. With regard to China, I think the Chinese would like to have the situation that obtained before the Yahapalanya government came into office, where we sort of veered closer to them than before. But the Chinese also know one simple thing, that economically, their stake here is so big that no one's going to kick them out. And so it's a question of that. I think the previous speaker talked about strategic hedging, as it were, the extent to which one party might want to do that as opposed to another. But they're here to stay, very much here to stay. And as far as the United States is concerned, I think, yes, it'll rather work through India and the Australia and that sort of axis, rather than want to get more directly involved. So, this notion that foreigners are going to affect our election in any big way, I'm not so sure about that. And also that they are responsible for the crisis that we have got ourselves into. I totally reject that. What possibly happened is that when we got into a crisis and when our polity broke up into various factions, they might have lent a bigger ear to one faction as opposed to another, but that they instigated it, I think is not something that I would accept. At the end of the day, that is the sense in which we are sovereign. We are the makers of our own mistakes.
And there is a question for Dr. Chulani. Do you see any political affiliations with our local parties and global superpowers when it's come to this election?
Well, I think Dr. Saranmuthu already answered that question in his remark, because even I don't think that any country right now is will in the world will make, especially in Sri Lanka, will make very direct influence in Sri Lanka's politics. No, there is always subtle influence here, obviously because they have their strategic interest in Sri Lanka, they have economic interest in Sri Lanka. So these players will be always there in Sri Lanka. To what extent they get, to what extent their influence become more significant depends on the party in power and their equation with each of these parties. But I think even NPP is accepting the fact that it has to engage closely with India and other regional and global players in order to govern a country. So and form its policies. So there will, I don't say that there are direct influence or direct intervention in terms of Sri Lanka's election, but certainly, of course, there will be always influences. That's very normal for global players.
And another question is also actually it's from Bhagya Senaratna to Dr. Chulani. Can you elaborate on the other countries, Japan and Russia, that you didn't have time to focus on?
Well, with Japan, I think we have always had a very strong but peaceful relationship, and with Japan, we will continue to have similar kind of partnership. It was once one of our major investment and development aid partner. But in the coming years, what we would also see is Japan in the form of the Quad, with United States, India, and Australia increasing its engagement with Sri Lanka. When it comes to Russia, I think it's a very complicated situation at the moment, especially because of the Russian-Ukraine war. While we get a lot of our income from tourists from Russia and etc. We also saw some very concerning issues in the past because of Sri Lankans joining this conflict as soldiers through different means as employment paths. So because of that, our relationship with Russia will have some conflicting situation, but at the moment, I think it is more related to the Ukraine, what's going on in their own country.
Thank you so much. So
That's it?
yes.
No further questions?
No.
Comments?
Someone had a
Huh?
question open to both these ways.
No, there is. Yes. The question from Nalin Herat to Dr. Saravanamuthu. We observed 2 elections in UK and France. Within very short period, all elections were conducted peacefully. However, it seemed that Sri Lankan society is highly politically divided. How do you analyze this?
Well, I am a convener of something called the Center for Monitoring Election Violence, and we've monitored elections since 1997. And I like to think that our contribution has led to the substantial reduction in the incidence of violence as far as elections are concerned. However, this is going to be a close election, at least in terms of it's a three-cornered fight. Now, there's nothing to discount the fact that at the last moment, everyone will coalesce around a single candidate. But the closer the election, and certainly a general election, I would think that there will be a degree of violence. One can't discount that. One hopes that there can be ways in which it can be prevented, but one must be prepared for it. The other point, of course, is that it, on a more broader, more sort of metaphorical notion of what violence constitutes, there is an argument in certain quarters that certain parties will not accept a particular result because it goes against their fundamental worldview and impression of what the campaign and all of that has been, and that there might be something to do with computers in terms of the count and all of that. Well, we will try to monitor to the best of our abilities, but there is no, gainsaying that that is possible, but not entirely probable.
That's it?
Yes. I think Dr. Indrajit wanted.
Yeah, Dr. Kumar.
Dr. Kumar, Indrajit, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make an observation in relation to what Sarah said about the Indian relationship. I tried to emphasize how important it was to get this 5% plus growth. And the low-hanging fruit there is to treat India as an opportunity rather than a threat. Because you just have to look at what happened in East and Southeast Asia, when first Japan and then China had their growth surges. The countries in East and Southeast Asia were able to plug in to the supply chains that were created by that growth process, and they all were kind of lifted up. So there is no reason why that can't be replicated, particularly if India gives substance to its neighborhood first policy. The second thing is, while we've had proximity forever with India, transaction costs across the border have been very high because both countries had awful infrastructure. Now, roads, airports, even railways are all improving in both countries. So transaction costs are coming down. So, one way of probably the lowest hanging fruit in terms of getting to that 5% growth is to basically leverage what is happening in India now, particularly South India, which is growing at double digits. So, and that's not just the job of the government. our businesses have to be much more aggressive in understanding that there is a big opportunity out there. And hopefully we can get the trade negotiations also progress to make it easier to do that. But that is a massive opportunity. And the other thing is in terms of the sentiment towards India, I'm not sure we have fully appreciated how close we were to a major humanitarian disaster in the first half of 2022. And also the role actually played by the founder of the Pathfinder Foundation, Milinda Morogoda, who was then the High Commissioner in Delhi, a pivotal role he played in mobilizing that 4 billion. That money was crucial in averting, it was pretty difficult and pretty awful, I know the conditions, but it could easily have descended into a major humanitarian disaster if India hadn't come up with that money. Because it bought us time to get the other relationships going, the IMF program, on stream and other bilateral and multilateral money. But if that 4 billion didn't come in, we would have had a massive humanitarian disaster. And I don't think that is fully appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, we can move on to the next item. Having thanked the 4 presenters for explaining the situation in the country and in relation to the country, I thank you very much indeed for your contributions. Now I will pass on the floor to Dr. Dayananda Silva, who will do the closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Gunathilaka. Distinguished members of the panel, dear participants. As we bring this insightful webinar to a close, I would like to take a moment to reflect on the valuable discussion we had today. I think this is the second webinar of the webinar series that Pathfinder Foundation and ISAS have jointly organized during the recent past. At the outset, on behalf of the Pathfinder Foundation and on behalf of Ambassador, our chairman, Ambassador Gunathilaka, let me extend sincere gratitude to the excellent team from ISAS, headed by Director and Associate Professor Iqbal Seva, for collaboration with us in organizing this event. We are very pleased to continue our fruitful collaboration as we previously discussed and agreed. As for today's event, I think we had an excellent discussion. I would like to extend our deepest gratitude to all the 4 speakers, distinguished panel of speakers. Dr. Indranix Kumaraswamy, very pleased to see you, sir. Dr. Rajini Gamage, Dr. Pakisotti Saranamuthu, and Dr. Chulani Attanayaka for sharing your insights on this number of important topics, built into one agenda within a period of 2 hours. All the 4 speakers have provided us with a nuanced understanding of Sri Lanka's current political landscape, socio-economic dynamics at play, and challenges and opportunities. In the broader regional context within South Asia. Dr. Rajini, thank you very much. You very briefly, eloquently presented complex, multiple political alliances being formed towards the presidential election and their policies, major differences of the different political parties' election agenda, both economics and political, you eloquently explained, including the minor political parties, political candidates. Dr. Kumaraswamy always give us a very good analysis of the current economic state, and starting with the highlighting the turnaround in the economy. I fully agree with, as reflected in the World Bank data. Country has performed very well in number of aspect: inflation, interest rate, revenue collection, and the external account management. These are very, the positive thing, turning negative economic growth to the positive economic growth. And also the poverty elevation and the debt restructuring. One thing I clearly agree with you, Sri Lanka, to come out of this crisis, the road is not easy. It is hazardous and bumpy. To come out of this crisis, totally agree, what we need is the consensus and consistent and the predictability and the transparency manner continue our policy reform agenda, especially aligning with the IMF program. IMF program, different political parties have different position. Slightly you can deviate from how do you achieve the target, but these overall targets established by the IMF, meeting them, whatever the formula you have are very important. Dr. Pakeshwati, you always come with very, the critical thinking, and I note that what is important is to unity and the diversity. That is the point you emphasize. Animating the culture of governance and political culture is far more important. Finally, thank you explaining, Dr. Chulani, interacting with the three major political players, India, China, and USA, and balancing those interests are in favor of us, and have a clear policy how you managing the interaction with these regional politics in our future interaction with them. Finally, I have to thank very importantly all the participants who, in fact, we received an overwhelming response. We received more than 100 inquiries, and today event was attended by more than 50 participants. Thank you very much. Your questions, clarification, and active engagement and make this event more successful event. And thank you very much. Once again, thank you for the ISAS team. We would look forward to working very closely with you in organizing, moving forward our webinar series on topics interest to Sri Lanka and for this region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.